Well, I had been in the insurance business for just short of 1 year when I woke up one morning and decided that I really wasn't happy and wasn't enjoying doing that. Farmers Insurance Company, it was a good company, and I had done good with my policies. In fact, when I decided I was going to be finished with that, I had written 222 policies in about 10 months. Anything from life insurance to car insurance to health insurance to commercial liability insurance, and the money was fair. It wasn't great, but it was good. But I just didn't enjoy all the time I had to spend away from my home and my family and Debbie. So I said, well, I think I'll look at something else. I don't know what I want to do, but I don't think I want to do this anymore. I was out making cold calls one day on small businesses trying to sell them these small health insurance plans, and they were pretty easy to sell. There was a pretty good value. And I went in this employment agency over around Haltom City somewhere and sit down with a lady and explain the policy and all that. And she says, well, I might be interested in that. But she says, are you enjoying what you're doing? And I go, well, not really. I said, I've got out of the military and couldn't get on with the airlines. And so this was kind of a backup plan that my father had been in the insurance business for 20 plus years. And I just didn't want to do this anymore. And she says, well, I have a client in Dallas that every once in a while he hires, and he's looking for people exactly like you. She says she wants somebody that's a hard worker and somebody that's had maybe some ex-military experience because they're more disciplined and better people to work with. And she says, would you mind if I call Dallas and ask him if he's interested, and if so, would you go on an interview? And I said, well, sure I would. I said, I'm looking for something else. I just hadn't really actively started looking yet. And she said, well, I'll give you a call here in a couple days, and why don't you go ahead and write up this health insurance plan for myself and my employees, and then I'll give you a call here in a couple days. So I did that, and 2 days later she calls me up. She says, hey, the guy that I talked to in Dallas, he's very interested in talking to you, and I'm going to give you his name and number, and he's the division manager for a beer brewery, the Schlitz Brewing Company.
Schlitz, coming at you.
When you order a Schlitz, you don't think about the months it takes us to brew and age it. But the long, careful, golden age of Schlitz is what makes it America's choicest premium beer.
And says what they hire for is field sales representatives, which means you'll have a territory and you'll have a certain responsibility with wholesalers within that territory. But he'll explain all that to you if you want to go over there. I said, sure. So I give him a call. So I called up, and Jim Lowry, talked to him for a couple of minutes, not very long. And he said, yeah, he says, I really would be interested in visiting with you. I've got a couple of vacancies, and we'll need to send you to training if we hire you, but you'll be on the payroll within 10 days after I get the okay signal to hire you. So I went over to Dallas, just off Mockingbird Lane, and sit down. Nice office area. They had 3 or 4 offices in a conference room, and there was division manager Jim Lowry and his assistant and 2 secretaries, and in a conference room. So I sit down visiting with him a little bit, and he said, well, you're going to be kind of a communicator between the brewery and our franchised wholesalers. And you communicate to them our plans and our programs and what we want them to do, and make sure that they're taking care of the product properly. And then in return, you communicate from the wholesalers to us some of the areas that they feel like we could improve in either marketing or packaging or whatever. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be interested in doing that. And he said, okay. He says, you're hired as far as I'm concerned, but he said, I'm going to have to send you to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to interview with the corporate people up there. And he said, I'll buy you a plane ticket, and you'll fly up in the morning, you'll interview 3 or 4 people, and then fly back that evening. So a couple of days later, he called me up, and he said, hey, here's your flight. You can pick up the tickets at the Braniff Terminal and head off on up there. I said, okay, great. So I went on, jumped on a plane, flew to Milwaukee, and got up there, got a cab to the corporate headquarters, the main headquarters for the Schlitz Brewery was there. Beautiful old buildings, 100, 125-year-old buildings, and really nice offices. And, 100 people or better just working in the administrative part of the offices here. And I said, well, this is a pretty nice place. And I went up to the top floor where our training center for the brewery was, and I interviewed with the chief guy in charge of training, a guy named Jim Hare. And Jim had the absolute best training program of any brewery in existence at that time. Beautiful facilities and mock-ups of bars and grocery stores and just a really first-class operation. I said, well, this is a first-line company, a quality company. I really would like to work with them. So I visited with Jim for a little while, and he seemed very cordial and pleasant. And he says, you got to interview with a couple other people. So I interviewed with a guy named Abe Guston, and he wasn't the happiest guy in the world. He seemed like he was pretty straight-laced and forward and kind of looking to find some loopholes in whatever questions that I answered for him. But I got through with his, and I did 2 other interviews. And when I got all done, Jim Hare comes up to me, and he says, you've passed all of our interviews, you're hired. And he says, I want you to go catch a cab, fly back to Texas, and we'll send you some instructions in a few days as to who to report to and when you're going to start. And so I thanked him and left the building, got on the cab, and went back to Texas. And so I went over and told my boss that I worked for at Farmers Insurance Group that I was going to leave, that I just didn't like spending all the time away from home and my family. And I had an opportunity that I thought would take me further in life than the one that I had. So he said, okay, I understand. He says, you did a good job writing for me, and we'll just split your policies up with some other guys, and good luck.
Hey, Bill, where can a guy get another Schlitz around here? And excuse me, Bill?
What's a beautiful girl like you doing at a party like this?
I'm giving it. Anything wrong?
Let myself introduce me. I'm Schlitz.
You're out of Schlitz.
There's just one Schlitz, yeah, nothing else comes near. When you're out of Schlitz,
Just ask.
you're out of beer.
A couple days later, Jim Lowry calls me, and he says, okay, he says, you need to come over next Monday morning and to the Dallas office, and you're going to spend a week working in the Dallas office, learning some of the administrative duties you'll have and some of the responsibilities you'll have, and you'll spend most of the week with my assistant, a guy named Lloyd Hughes. So I showed up there Monday, and Lloyd Hughes was a super, super nice guy, old guy, but very sharp, and he like Jim Lowry, were both from Wisconsin, and so they spoke with a little funny accent, but I managed to understand most of what they said. And we spent about 2 days of him explaining to me how to fill out the expense report. And he says, in your job here, he says, there's a lot of important things that you need to learn, but this expense report is one of the most important ones, because that's the one that's going to put some money in your pocket and compensate you for what you're spending. And so he says, when you go out, you don't necessarily have to eat breakfast, but you're going to put down in this breakfast slot on the expense account, you're going to put $3 to $4. And he says, when you may not necessarily eat lunch every day, but when you go out to lunch, you're going to put down there $6 to $8 for lunch. And then he says, for dinner, we always like to have nice dinners, and you have a few drinks with it. And he says, so you only want to put about $10 to $15 down for dinner. And then he says, there's a category here for bar spending, and he says we like to keep that around $10 to $15 per day. But he says, you make sure that you put some bar spending in there every single day. He said, because there's some days when you may not spend any, but there's other days you may go out and spend $30, $40. And of course, at that time, buying a draft beer in a bar was like a quarter. So you had to spend quite a bit of money in order to spend $15 or $20 in a bar. Anyway, so I understood the instructions and finished up that week. And the next week, they sent me off to Longview, Texas, to work with a guy named Carl Shirley. Carl was one of the more mature, long-term employees of Schlitz. He'd been there in East Texas for probably 10, 12 years, and so I went over and got with him, and a nice guy, easygoing guy. I realized after about the second or third day that he was really a good hard worker, but he like many of the people I seem to run into, they were all in love with the beer, and they like to drink. So I guess you could call them semi-professional alcoholics. So we spent the whole week just riding from one bar to the next bar, went to a couple, 3 different markets, and drank beer everywhere we went. And then at the end of the week, supposed to get a test, and there wasn't any test. It was just, okay, you passed. And of course, I found out right away after the first couple of weeks that their goal wasn't necessarily to teach me a whole lot about what I should be doing, but it was to kind of test to make sure that I could hold my alcohol without becoming obnoxious or falling down drunk. And that was hard to do because these guys were professional drinkers, and I didn't drink at all till I got into business. So anyway, I went through week after week training. I trained in Dallas, and I trained in Fort Worth, and I trained in Austin, and I trained in San Antonio, and in Lubbock, and Houston. And so I just about covered the entire state, and every one of the people I worked with were super nice people, easy to get along with. And I thought, I'm going to enjoy this because of the good people. The wholesalers, equally, a lot of the wholesalers were very mature, older guys, anywhere from middle 50s to 70 plus, and they were just experts in their business. In the state of Texas, Schlitz Brewing Company products, and there wasn't a whole lot of them, but our products had an average share of market of 50%. We outsold everybody else in the market. There were certain pockets in areas like in South Texas, San Antonio area where Lone Star and Pearl were stronger. There was a few markets like Dallas and Fort Worth that Budweiser and Miller not so much, but more Budweiser was strong in the market. But generally, Schlitz dominated the state of Texas. And to explain a little bit about the beer business in Texas, there was a state law that required every container of beer to be 12-ounce or 12-ounce equivalents. So you couldn't have all these oddball size packages. You could have 12-ounce or you could have 24-ounce, and that was about it. You could have it in cans or you could have it in bottles, but basically the sizes were pretty restricted. And that was something to help the wholesaler because the more packages that he had to carry, the more complicated his inventory system was. So they had a pretty good deal there going in Texas. In fact, just 2 years before I started in the business, Jim Lowry, the division manager, had talked the brewery into producing a 24-ounce can. They call it a tall boy. And nobody else in the industry in that area had anything like it. And so the tall boy can became a very high volume and, of course, high profit for everybody for Schlitz. And we only carried a couple of brands. We carried Schlitz, and we carried Schlitz malt liquor. Old Milwaukee was a regional beer. It wasn't even in the state of Texas at the time. And a lot of the other brands that we sooner or later took over weren't in the state either. So it was a very simple package mix. And like I say, high volume and high profit. All the wholesalers were millionaires and very smart business people. So one particular week I was supposed to work, this is toward the end of my training, and they said that you're going to work with the draft manager who is working out of Kansas City. And he is a very smart man, said you need to pay attention to everything he says. He's really a hard ass as far as paying attention and taking good notes and doing what he wants you to do. And so he says, you're going to work with him. Well, several weeks earlier, when I was going every week, I was flying from Dallas, Love Field, out to some area, whether Houston, San Antonio, wherever it was. And I always flew on Braniff Airlines because Braniff was the major carrier there out of that hub in Dallas. And so first time I showed up there to get my ticket and check in, I went up to the ticket agent there at the gate and handed him my boarding pass. And he said, hey, he says, you got an unusual last name, Vanover. And I said, yeah, there's not a whole lot of us around. And he said, go put your bags down over there. And he said, come back up here and visit with me. And I said, okay. And I thought, well, I hope I hadn't done anything wrong here. I'm just checking in. So I went back up there, and he said, the reason I thought your name was unusual, he says, because my name is Vanover. And I said, you're kidding. And he said, yeah, they call me Smokey Vanover, and I'm the chief union steward for Love Field Braniff Airlines. And so he was an important guy. He was just filling in for somebody that didn't show up for work that morning that I caught him. And so he said, well, you got about 45 minutes before you got to go. He said, I got a golf cart over here. He says, let's you and I just go ride around the terminal. I said, man, this sounds like fun. So we got on the cart and we rode around talking about where our families and ancestry and history and all this. We could not come up with any link that tied us together, so we decided that we were cousins. And when he dropped me back off at my gate ready to get on board, he says, just a second here, I'm going to change your boarding pass. And he went over to the agent and got another boarding pass, came back. He says, you're going to be flying first class. He said, anytime you come here to fly, and he said, I work usually 8 to 4, Monday through Friday, and so I'll be here every time that you're here. And he says, just ask for me as soon as you get here, and I'll come pick you up on my golf cart, and we'll ride around and visit till it's time for you to go fly. And he says, you're going to be flying first class on every flight. I said, man, this is super. So anyway, I did that for 4, 5, 6 weeks, and like I said, I was getting ready to go to Houston, and I went over to Love Field, and I got a hold of Smokey, and he gave me my first class boarding pass. And so they loaded us all on this aircraft. I think it was a 727. And I mean, it was packed. There wasn't a seat left in the back. And of course, the majority of the travelers on a Monday morning like that are business travelers, and they had briefcases and suitcases and all kinds of stuff. It was just like a madhouse in the back. And of course, I'm up front. I give the stewardess my boarding pass, and she sits me down and brings me a beer right off the bat, to kind of make me feel at home, make me feel like I'm first class.
How about a beer, fellas?
Great. George,
What's the fuss, Gus?
beer.
All around, y'all.
Or change the pace, Grace.
Something special then.
Gotcha. Here comes the bull. Bull, the Schlitz malt liquor bull.
And so I rode all the way down to Houston. I got off the aircraft, and I was one of the first ones off, being in first class. And Bill Nichols, the district manager for Houston, was there waiting on me. He said, hey, Gene, how are you? And I had worked with him several weeks earlier. And he's another one that had been in his district for like 20 years. And so senior guy, smart guy, knew everything about everything. And he says, where's Sam Levette, your draft guy? I said, I didn't really enjoy the back there, so I decided I'd upgrade to first class. So I rode up first class, but I'm pretty sure Sam is in the back there somewhere. So he'll be out shortly. So here comes Sam Levette dragging one of the last people off the airplane. Had 2 giant briefcases full of draft materials and books and faucets and all kinds of stuff. And he said, walked up to me. He says, you Vanover? And I said, yes, sir. He says, what in the hell, where were you? And I said, I was riding up front, Sam. I said, it's so crowded in the back, I didn't want to ride back there. That's just not right. And he said, what'd you do? I said, well, I just upgraded to a first class boarding pass, and I rode up front. And I said, y'all try that sometime. He said, well, the Beret don't pay for that. And I said, I ain't worried about that. And anyway, so we kind of got started off on the wrong foot. So all week long, I'm following Sam around, and he is putting on these really good draft beer demonstrations on how to set up draft systems and how to troubleshoot the systems and everything. And I'm taking, pretty good notes, I think. And we get toward the end of the week, and Sam is still not too impressed with me because he didn't think I was paying enough attention. And he said, well, Vanover, we got one last presentation we're going to do up here in Conroe today. And he says, you want to help me with it? And I said, no, I really don't want to help you. I said, I'll just do the presentation. He said, you don't know enough to do it. And I said, yeah, I think I do. I said, this isn't that hard. And he said, all right. He said, let's just see how good you are, smart ass. And you lead the whole presentation, and I'll jump in there when you need me. And so we went through the presentation, and I had almost copied verbatim every word that he had said in the previous one. So the presentation turned out really, really good. And Sam, when it was all over, he said, Vanover, he says, I don't understand exactly everything about you, but you did a hell of a job on that. And he said, you even answered the troubleshooting problems without any issues. And he said, so you're passing with flying colors, but I still ain't figured out about that first class boarding pass thing. I'm going to check into it. And so that ended up our week. And when we flew back to Dallas, I actually flew in the back with him because I couldn't get a first class boarding pass coming out
The
of
long,
Houston.
careful golden age of
And,
Schlitz
that
is what
was the
makes
end
it
of that
America's
training.
choicest premium beer.
Well, I got all done with the training, and it was time me to graduate and finish up. And Jim Lowry called me up. He said, well, Vanover, he said, you passed all 13 weeks. He said, you got really outstanding remarks from all the district managers you worked with, and everybody seems to like you and get along with you real well. And he said, so we got one more thing we have to do, and then we'll be done.